Okay. Thank you for coming back. I appreciate all of your faces. Well, it's my tremendous pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Terry Sanowski. To many of you, he will need no introduction, but if you will oblige me, I'd like to still give at least a small one. It was great to see that earlier picture of Terry and Jeff Hinton sitting on what I learned now is the stoop of Terry's apartment in Brookline from so long ago, because it really sort of points to the fact that Terry has been a leader and a real dominant force in this, what we now know is this field attempting to combine brains and machines and computations and neurobiology. And he's been there since the beginning and has been instrumental in building that bridge and setting down really even the foundations on either side of that bridge that has become a metaphor for the afternoon. He has been recognized, of course, for this work. He's now the Francis Crick Professor here at the Salk Institute, and that's, I think, a fitting kind of named professorship for him. He's also recently been awarded the Brain Prize in conjunction with Larry Abbott and Chaim Sampolinsky for his kind of foundational work in mapping out these links between the brain and behavior and cognition. And his work dates back to the very foundations of neural network theory, inventor or one of the inventors of the Boltzmann machine, who really laid the foundation for nearly all of the work and many of the analysis techniques that are so widely used today. So it's really my tremendous pleasure and honor to welcome Terry Sanowski. Please join me.
So, Tim, thanks for the generous introduction. The talks today have been amazing, and I've learned a lot from each one of them. And I also want to say that KIBM has been very special here in our community. I remember, when Nick and when you were starting out, when we were starting out, it wasn't clear what the connection was between the brain and the mind, because the faculty were in different buildings and different departments. Jeff Ellman was a very important bridge in that respect. He studied language here. He was in cognitive science. But the community has really integrated. It also, in terms of the beginnings of neural networks, the parallel distributed processing group was here. It started here back in the 70s, right, with David Mahart and Jay McClellan. So we have a tradition here. In fact, I moved here from Johns Hopkins because of the fact that the faculty here had 10 years of experience with thinking along these lines. And so I felt right at home. So thanks for organizing this meeting. Thanks to Jen and Ed for leading us. I think they were only the second group that has led the KIBM. And also for the organizers, I think John, Tim, and Tanya really put together a terrific program. Okay, so as you know, the Nobel Prizes in chemistry and physics were given for AI. And if you really think back, in the early days of AI in the 20th century, it was based on symbol processing, logic, and rules. Black and white, yes or no. But the world is not black and white. It's very high dimensional, and it's very difficult to capture that complexity in simple rules. And it was even worse if you ask someone in AI, can you help me with understanding how the brain works? They say, sure. All you have to do is to find where the symbol is in the brain and you'll win a Nobel Prize. It's worse, a neuroscientist would say, what does it look like? How should I find it? And that was the end of the discussion, because there was very little mathematical sort of similarity between the signals that neuroscientists measure and the very, very discrete mathematics. In fact, writing computer programs was the traditional way you solved the problem. But machine learning really changed all that, and really learning from experience is something biology, of course, discovered long ago in terms of being able to take brains of any species and adapt them to the local conditions. And it was really only 10 years ago that deep learning, when we had enough computer power, they were able to actually scale up with many layers and also a lot of data. And so this book was published by the MIT Press in 2018, and the tagline is Artificial Intelligence Meets Human Intelligence. And the reason is that these are very simple models, of course, compared to the complexity of the brain. However, the mathematics that we're using to analyze them is the same as the mathematics we use to analyze large populations of neurons. There's now a commonality, a common mathematical foundation. And the rapid rate at which progress is being made on both sides is really breathtaking. However, 2 years ago, OpenAI released ChatGPT, which now has transformed the way that the public thinks about AI. And it really is transformative. It's as if an alien suddenly appeared on the earth, speaking in perfect English and having the entire knowledge base of the world at its fingertips, right? The only thing we can be sure about ChatGPT is that it's not human. And that's a big mistake that a lot of people make, is that they're judging it by comparing it to human behavior. It's different. It's very different. And there are a lot of similarities, obviously, but we have to look at both the similarities and the differences. So let me take you quickly into the heart of these ChatGPT and other large language models. Okay, so this diagram is actually very, very opaque. If you actually take it apart and look at all the lines and everything, which I'm not going to do, it has a lot of parts of it. By the way, this is just one module. NX means you may have N modules stacked on top of each other. But each one has various components. I'm going to talk a little bit about the self-attention in a minute. But the key is that it's a feed-forward network. There's no feedback in it. And the same thing with the encoder. You give it your question, it goes in, and it goes through all the layers. And on the output, it looks at what word is the highest probability and outputs that. And then that goes to the input. There's a large input, which consists of all the words that have been put into it and all the words that it's saying. So there's a loop here. Word after word after word. The thing that surprised me the most was that when I asked it some question or write a poem, and you press the button, it would always take 2 seconds, no matter what the question was. And it would come out with a whole page. I mean, it's not like it was like a human, sort of hem and haw for a while. It would just knew the answer right off the bat. I mean, in some ways, it's already superhuman. But the point I want with this red arrow here is telling us something. It's a clue. It was trained to predict the next word in the sentence, which is self-supervised. It's not given any labels. It's not told what to do. There's no task here, natural language task. It's just, guess the next word. And what's amazing is that with that training, and with a very large model, now it's trillions of weights, it can do many, many natural language tasks. Some better than others, but it's truly remarkable and unpredicted. I didn't know that it could happen. Now, let's take a look at this. And by the way, in terms of comparing to brains, rather than look at the details of obviously many differences, let's extract the general principles and see what the difference is. Like, for example, the difference in AI was that they had the central processing unit, the von Neumann architecture, and of course the brain has 100 billion neurons working in parallel, so the architecture was completely different. Highly interconnected neurons, a lot of parameters, and learning was completely missing from AI. So, you know, clearly they left a lot on the floor. But here, let's compare this architecture to the brain's architecture. So this model, in fact, deep learning in general is really a model for the cerebral cortex. And of course, there's 100 other areas in the brain. And one in particular that's particularly important for this task, talking, is the basal ganglia. So here is the motor cortex. You know, this is for, you know, topographically organized. The entire cortex, including the prefrontal cortex, projects down to the basal ganglia. So here's the projection, and we know the basal ganglia is really important for both learning and producing sequences of actions. And it learns through dopamine. It takes a lot of practice, for example, to become a good tennis player. It becomes a lot of practice to become an expert in anything. It's basically something that you automatizes these actions so that you don't have to think about it. But what's interesting is it projects back to the cortex. There's a loop. And when, you know, have you ever thought, where does the next word come from your mouth? You know, where does it come from? I'm not planning 10 words ahead, I'm sorry. But word after word after word comes out of your brain, right? Word after word comes out of the transformer. So I think this loop here is something that we should take a look at. It's a principle, maybe this idea of a loop. Now, I mentioned earlier that the dopamine neurons are very important for the process of learning. Dopamine neurons are very important for motivation, for the speed with which you respond. And what they represent, the transient part of the dopamine signal, is reward prediction error. So prediction error is really important, and of course that's how transformers learn, from prediction error. Now there's something in this box that is a little mysterious, this multi-headed attention. And what it does is it tries to learn, it's a big matrix, it tries to learn the relationship between words on the input. There's a sequence of words that comes in, and it's got to figure out how the words are related to each other. For example, if the word this appears, and maybe in the previous sentence there were 3 nouns, the question is which noun does it correspond to? And you get that from the context. And it doesn't call, you know, it's obvious to us, but it has to learn that. And it learns it in the same way that it learns the feed-forward weights. But it's a matrix, so it's a lot bigger, a lot more parameters. We're going to come back to that. Now, basal ganglia. Okay, so let's look at it. Here's the cortex with feed-forward and feedback connections. And here's the basal ganglia, which gets projections. It's roughly topographic, but it's actually broader than just point to point. And then there's this feedback. So there's this feedback loop for each part of the cortex. And if you look at that block diagram, you'll see that the self-attention actually is a loop from the layer for the input out to the self-attention and back, and they're combined. Self-attention is combined with the feed-forward input. So the basal ganglia is in a really good position to be able to be providing something like attention. By the way, self-attention has nothing to do with attention. Neuroscientists study. At least it's not directly related. It has more to do with these associations, which are could be across many words, many sentences, and even paragraphs. Okay, so this is what I want to focus on now, temporal context. So in the transformer, temporal context is actually contained in the input. The input is, they're called tokens for different words, is accumulated, and they can be tens of thousands of tokens long. That means you can have self-attention across a huge, wide range of words. Now, you're listening to one word at a time, and the question is, where are those words going? And how can you remember things that I've said at the beginning of the lecture so you can ask a question at the end, right? There's got to be some way that this information is stored. It's not going to be stored the way that a computer would store it. So the words come in. When you're reading a book, you're looking at, fixating a group of words, bang, bang, bang. So the words are going into your brain, and presumably at some high level, that information is accumulating. Where is that accumulated? And with the videos, it's even more complex because there's a much higher information rate, and you have to remember what's happening in the scene, and you're trying to, what people are saying at the same time. So this is something the brain's really good at. Now, there was a breakthrough that occurred before transformers in natural language translation. And it was with a recurrent network. And of course, the brain is filled with recurrent networks. In fact, layer 2-3 of the cortex is a highly recurrent network. CA3 in the hippocampus is a highly recurrent network. So here's now the way it was trained. It's called backpropagation through time. What you do is now each of these is a time step, and the words are coming in sequentially. And as they go in, there's a transformation. It's a pre-processing embedding. It's put into a vector, a long vector. And that goes into this recurrent network, and it circulates because it's recurrent. And then finally, you give it a go signal, and it's trained on a lot of sentences to output the sentence in the new language. Comment allez-vous? I think that's French. Okay, so that's how language translation was done. ChatGPT-4, by the way, is unbelievably good. I mean, I just can't believe it. It's just it's so good that it can't possibly be, so it wasn't trained to do language translation, but it does it beautifully. Okay, so here's now this attention matrix. It's very, very expensive because it goes as n squared. So that was recently replaced by a linear state space model. What is a linear state space model? Well, here are the equations. First order differential equation. This is a time derivative. A is the model matrix. And then there are inputs coming in. That's the U. So there's input weights and there's output weights. Y is the output. So the output weights. So it's just, a lot is known. It's used in signal processing. It's used in control theory. This is kind of bread and butter for an engineer. Now, Christopher Wray at Stanford did something really interesting. He said, let's replace the self-attention with the state space model here, right? So here's the input coming in, going through a layer of weights. Here's the parallel pathway through this now state space model. And lo and behold, by using a particular type of a model matrix, A, he was able to show that you can improve the performance and reduce the time that it takes for inference by 2 orders of magnitude in transformers. That translates into billions of dollars because of the fact that these big companies are putting hundreds of billions of dollars into data centers, and to the point now where they need to build nuclear power plants in order to feed them with power. So here's now a particular version. It's called Mamba. And I'm not going to go through this except to say that Mamba, with the state space model, is compared against a bunch of traditional transformer models, including GPT, on a bunch of different tasks. And the bold is the best performance. And it varies from 130 million weights up to 2.8 billion weights. So this is really quite amazing, quite amazing. Well, what is the secret about the matrix, right? I told you that it's not just an arbitrary matrix. It turns out it's a matrix called a tuplets matrix. So what's a tuplets matrix? So here's this A matrix. It has the same value along the main diagonal, A0, and along each of the diagonals, right? A above, A2, and so forth. There are n parameters here. order n compared to n squared scales a lot better, and that's the reason why it is learning much faster. But there's other reasons too, mathematical reasons. First of all, this form of this matrix, tuplets matrices, there's a huge literature on it, and it has to do with the fact that they implement something called temporal convolution. In other words, if we put a vector here, the vector is getting convolved, each with different time delays, right? If time goes down. And that really it makes a lot of sense, because we want to take words in and we want to compare across different words. So here is one of the simplest tuplets matrices. Okay, so it's 0 everywhere except above the diagonal, and it turns out this is the equation for a first order wave equation. So here's the network model. So we see that you know, H are the units in a recurrent network, and X are the inputs. And so here is this is the discrete form of this differential equation, which is an equation that creates traveling waves. Traveling waves are found ubiquitously in physics. Sound, electricity and magnetism, right? Those are all traveling waves, and so are gravitational waves. So this is something that's universal for transmitting information over a long distance, over time. Now, you know, this is a comparison now between what a fully connected recurrent neural network initiated with random small numbers, which everybody in AI does, what it looks like when you're just simulating the dynamics. These are the units. This is time. You can see it's kind of very, very salt and peppery. But if you have a conventional convolutional recurrent neural network with the activity, starting out with that matrix that I showed you, you can see these beautiful traveling waves that are going at, you know, at a particular constant velocity through space. This is called, in the AI, it's called inductive bias. So we're going to start with a matrix that looks like this instead of this and ask what's the difference in performance. So I collaborated with Max Welling and his student Andy Keller. And here's this task is a classic task for recurrent neural networks. It's called a copy task. What you do is you give it an input, and this input here consists of, I think there are like 10 units, and you're turning each one on at a different time, sequence and time, right? So this is a sequence of inputs. And then what you do is you give it a cue here, and it's trained to be able to give you the same input sequence, right? So that's just spitting out exactly what it was told. And you can now make it more difficult by having a time delay of 10 or 30 or 80 or 100, okay? And you'll notice that it is able to, with 100% accuracy after it's trained, give you exactly the same input. Okay, so here now is this is the randomized recurrent network. Even after 0 time delay, it's making mistakes, and it just completely fails when you go above 30. Now, okay, so that's great. Performance is much better, but look at the training. Okay, so this is a mean square error, and it's a log scale, and the recurrent network, the randomized network, the random network is in green, and the wave network is in red. And here you go. Literally, within the first 100 steps, it's already gone down by 4 orders of magnitude. It's about 2 orders of magnitude faster for t equals 0, and it's even faster for t equals 30. In fact, by t equals 80, basically, it's learned it with about the same time, but you know, it's so much better that it really means that if you have to do any sequence task, this is the best place to start. And here's one that's more difficult. You give it a sequence of inputs, which are numbers, you know, 5, 23, 16, and every once in a while you say, remember this number, and that was at a random time. And now, the next time you get that, you should add it in, right? 5, and then 13, and then at the end you ask, what's the sum? So this is adding numbers. Again, the wave network learns much, much more quickly, And by the time you get to time, it's 1,000 time steps, it can't learn it at all. And just look at this, the errors down to the 10 to the minus 5. Amazing. Okay, so it turns out you can do arithmetic with these wave neural networks. You can do all kinds of processing. You can do push and pop, which is a computer operation where you're doing recursion. It can do recursion. And I've collaborated with Hava Siegelman and one of her students, Arjun Kutvali, who showed that you can actually do something called variable binding. In other words, if you want in your computer program to say x equals 5, you can tell the network that and it'll remember x is 5 as it goes on. So this has amazing capabilities. If you start with waves, you can do math. Now, now I'm going to switch to the Cortex now and ask, what does the connectivity pattern look like? Okay, well, we know it's a Mexican hat. We know that if you're in the middle of a column, that you're connected to neighboring neurons with excitatory connections. And if you are a little bit further away, the next column, you have net inhibitory impact on them. And so this Mexican hat really is very, very common and universal. And so here's what the connection matrix looks like. So you can see that it's red around the diagonal, and then it's blue around the side. That's a tuplets matrix, right? The diagonals have the same value. What does that tell you? What it tells me is that this is going to be a good connectivity to start with in terms of inductive bias for doing sequences, for traveling waves. Now, this matrix has been around for a long time, and it was shown early on by Sebastian Seung and others that you can implement a line attractor with it. So Hopfield, for example, one of the Nobel Prize winners, had point attractors, and a line attractor is very similar, except going to a point, you go to a line. A line means that all the activity patterns come to equilibrium, and now it's neutral along the line. You can push it back and forth, and it was used by Ketch and Zhang for modeling the head direction cells in rats. And recently you saw the ellipsoid body in flies, where you can actually visualize optically as the fly turns its head, you can see the little bump going back and forth, right? Well, it turns out that now let's simulate this, this ring model. And this is done with Lyle Muller and several students. So the connectivity is what I showed you, the Mexican hat. Nearby units have excitatory connections, and then more distant units have inhibitory connections or in this case, through inhibitory neurons. It's an integrating fire model. And I'm just going to turn, we fixed the weights, and then we turned it on, and this is what it looked like. Let's see if I can get this started. Here we go, okay. So one of the things you can see is that unlike the other wave model, which was one direction, this is bidirectional. There are waves going in both directions at the same time. And you see that they can go through each other because they're sparse. It's not all the neurons that are activated when you go through. It's only a small fraction. Same thing is true of traveling waves that are seen in the cortex. But, and we weren't able to get this behavior with small networks, with 100 or 1,000 weights of neurons, model neurons. We had to go up to 100,000. It's only then that you got this sparse traveling wave that represents what you see in the cortex. 100,000, of course, is a small number for the brain, but it's telling us that scaling here is really important. And if you analyze it with a power spectrum, it looks just like the power spectrum in the brain, and the slope of the spatial temporal frequency curve is the velocity of that wave. And you can see it's very well defined. Now, where to look for traveling waves? Well, we know that the hippocampus has this theta rhythm, which is 4 to 8 hertz in the rat. And this is a recording from Thanos Siapas's lab, an array of electrodes. Now, oscillation brings to mind synchrony. And synchrony is something that occurs when you have a lot of neurons spiking at the same time, right? Well, what does it look like? Now we have an array. You can't tell by recording from one neuron exactly what the pattern is across space, but now we can tell. And it's color-coded. So red is positive and blue is negative, and it goes from anterior to posterior. Beautiful traveling wave. And Yuri Bajaki has replicated this, and it's actually half a wavelength across the hippocampus. It's really amazing that, by the way, this is the mother of all oscillations. We're talking about a millivolt, right, as composed in Cortex. We're talking about microvolts. This has been around for a long, long time. Of course, no one really knows what to do with it, right? So let's ignore it. Okay, so let's dive into the hippocampus. So, we know a lot about the hippocampus, that the neurons in it represent places in the world, and if a rat runs along a track in 1D, there are neurons that are activated at different locations and here in different colors, and we've ordered them here in the vertical column, and this is the time it takes to go across the track. Now, when the rat goes to sleep, or if it just stops and it goes into grooming or feeding, we get replay. We get the very same units activated in order, but 6 times faster. Sometimes it goes in the opposite direction. And that's kind of interesting. So we know that somehow the hippocampus is able to remember sequences from things that have happened in the world, and it's able to replay them, both forward and backward. So we developed a model of this. This is work that was done by Yusi Chen when she was a graduate student in my lab. She's now at the University of Washington. So here's the Cajal diagram of the input coming in from the entorhinal cortex into the dentate gyrus, and then from there to CA3, very highly recurrent, then to CA1, and then output goes back to the entorhinal cortex. So here's the way simplified diagram of what I just told you. Now, I want to point out there's something here that is usually left out of this 3-neuron arc, which is that there is also a direct input from the entorhinal cortex to the CA1. So CA1 is getting 2 inputs. One is from CA3, and the other one is from CA1. But now let's think about time. Time. Time is the final frontier. You may think it's space. No, it's time. Okay, it's got to go through more synapses, and it's a recurrent network, so it's going to be delayed when it gets to CA1. And now CA1 is getting the next input, and it can compare it to what's coming from CA3. And what if CA3 was trying to predict the next input? This is a theme. I've already talked about this a couple times, right? Predicting the next input can take you a long distance, a long way. So that's what we think. CA3 stores the sequences, and we're going to train it as a predictive autoencoder. So autoencoders, traditional ones, basically compress the input by sub-hidden units and then try to reproduce the output identical to the input. You train it up, and it was actually here, Jeff Ellman actually was one of the ones involved with, and Dave Zipser, with the first attempts to use autoencoders in very small networks. Well, we made two differences, changes in the traditional autoencoder. We put a recurrent network in the middle, representing the transition from the input to the CA1, the output of the hippocampus. And the loss function, instead of just reproducing the input, is now predicting the next input, right? It's a predictive loss. This, by the way, this paper was published just a few months ago in Neuron. Okay, so here's a very nice set of inputs, place fields that are coming in. And we trained up the network so that it was able to reproduce that, to do the replay. By the way, if after you've trained it, you give it a new sequence of inputs, you basically get something that looks like it's just a bunch of random activity patterns. Now, most of the labs that study hippocampus, basically, the rat is given experience, and you record for a few days, and then you have to get your N up, so you go to another rat. And here's what happens, though, if you record from the same neurons over a month. You start out with these beautiful place fields, and you see that after a couple of weeks, it starts fading away. Well, that seems kind of strange, right? Why would it fade away? Well, it turns out that during our training, CA1 is representing prediction error. And now when the rat first goes around, you immediately get huge prediction error because there's no learning. And then eventually, as you get to learn where the place fields are for each neuron, CA1 no longer has to fire because it can predict perfectly what the next input is. And so this is a very different way to interpret the output of the hippocampus, CA1. It's basically helping CA3 to learn sequences. And now, okay, everybody says that these networks are black boxes. That's not true. It's because if you say that, it's because you have not looked in the black box. It's not black box, it's a white box. So we store two environments, and now what I'm showing you are the weights which is the connections between the units that are lined up here, and you can see they form beautiful Mexican hats. They're tuplets matrices. We use backprop through time in order to train this up, right? It converged to this connectivity pattern that we all know and love. However, it's never been measured in the hippocampus. Nobody knows what it is. But we know that this connectivity pattern will support traveling waves. So our prediction is when the connectomic people actually get around to it, that they're going to find this connectivity pattern along the AP axis. But, you know, we'll see. Now, what can you do with this? I could do a lot more than just remember a bunch of place fields. Here, we trained it up on a bunch of MNIST digits. You heard about that in Nicholas's talk. So here are two different sequences of handwritten digits, slightly different from each other. Now, after you train it up, you can now, it will remember that sequence. Of course, it's some kind of an average across all the training examples. And if you start with 0, it will reproduce that sequence. And if you start here at 3, it will also reproduce that sequence. So it's actually a very good at giving you a sequence, learning the sequence. Now again, we can go in and we can ask the question of, okay, well, what does it look like? What does the activity look like? We have access to every activity for every input. So let's look. So what we did was analyze the activity for all the different digits. Each dot is a particular digit because they're slightly different from each other. So is a different version of the same digit. And what we're doing here is doing independent component analysis. You're looking at pairs here. And in this 8-dimensional space, they're completely separated. Each one of those is completely separated. So it figured out how to cluster each of these different, all the different types of 3s and 2s and 1s. It can do more than recognize the digits. It also can be trained to do something called rotation invariance. In other words, if we rotate the 1, it's still a 1. Same thing with 0. So we trained it up on 0 and 1 rotated. And lo and behold, it was able to reproduce that. Okay, that's as advertised. But now let's go into the activity pattern. Now we're using principal component analysis. And what's amazing is that the rotation in space is recapitulated by a rotation. This is a trajectory of activity in PC space. It mimics the rotation. It does that for each of the digits, and each digit is separated in a different part of activity space. Isn't that neat? So there's actually a mirror of the actual invariance, whatever's going on outside, inside the activity. And you wouldn't notice that if you just looked at all the neurons being activated and so forth. You have to be able to analyze it and look to see what it looks like. And last example are sprites. These are movies, and there are 9 different sprites, and each one is doing a different action, has a different hairdo, and is doing different kinds of hands. So this is now a sequence of inputs from frames, and here we are again with ICA. It separates beautifully. So, this is a very nice result. It is something that required backprop through time. And then the question is, can you do this? And this question came up just in the last talk. Can you replace backprop through time with something that's more biologically plausible? And I'm here to tell you, Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And a lot of people have tried. And here's an example of something called recirculation, a two-layer network. This is something from Jeff and Jay back in the '88. And what they had was this idea that what you do is you have inputs coming in here and then going up. And this is now 2 different points in time. And the way you change the weights is by the difference between the input the first time and the input the second time. And since both of these are available at the same location and the input from H, you can use a very simple Hebb rule to update the V weights, and you can do the same thing for the U weights. And so, in fact, this, you can show that it actually does work in the sense that U converges to the transpose of V, which is what backprop actually is hard wires, which is on-biological. Well, here is a version of that has been updated by adding another learning rule for the recurrent neural network. And it was done by Mia Cameron, who's an undergraduate math major at UCSD. I love undergraduates because they don't know that you're giving them a problem that a dozen labs have tried to solve and failed. And they bring a lot of energy and enthusiasm and naivete, which is good because we need a different perspective. You need a new way of looking at the problem. That's really the problem. Everybody's looking at it the same way. Okay, so I won't go through this except to say that in addition to changing the weights on U and V, you're also changing the weights on W, and it works. So here's the target that we trained it on, and here's the recirculated output. When you're doing recall, you just run it straight through, and it works. It works at least for small problems. We're going to scale it up. But the question is, okay, this is a recurrent network. What about a feed-forward network? Now, by the way, we changed this to reciprocal learning for reasons that you're about to hear. So here's a typical feed-forward network, and in a backprop net, you go all the way up, and then you have the feedback of the gradient from the output layer, from the error, and you use that to update all the weights, right? Well, what we do here is the same thing that the backprop does, but we don't use recirculate. We do not use the gradient backprop in order to update the feedback weights. Instead, what we do is each layer can use local learning algorithms to learn what's called the pseudo-inverse of the feed-forward weights. And this is something, again, is very well known in mathematics, and there are algorithms for doing that. And so we can train each layer separately from all the others and with local learning algorithms. And so how well does it do? Well, we did 2 tests. There's an MNIST training set, and the dashed line is backprop. It learns very quickly, and that's why everybody uses it. Accuracy goes up to almost, like here, 95%. Now, Tim Lillicrap had a Nature article about 10 years ago showing that if you just use random feedback connections, you can do pretty well. It's not that, it doesn't learn that fast. And so here's in blue, you can see that it takes a lot longer. And the accuracy, as you can see, eventually reaches the same asymptote. So here's our reciprocal learning network. And you can see it's faster and reaches asymptote earlier. And the same thing is true with a set of 10 image categories, CFAR 10. Again, it's able to achieve about the same level of as backprop. And it learns very rapidly at the very beginning. You can get up to this point here. Of course, to become as good as backprop, it will take much more training. So this is very encouraging. These are small problems that don't come near to ImageNet, which is, of course, the level at which people are working. But I think what it's telling us is that even the simple learning algorithms that we all know and love can be in the right combination. You need more than one. You need a couple of different ones for different parts of the problem. Can be used to solve something that may be something that is not, if not competitive with backprop, but at least converges to the same results. Now, the other thing is that all of the traveling waves have been found all over the place, But no one has ever shown that they have any connection with behavior, and that's part of the reason why they've been ignored. That all changed in 2020 when John Reynolds published a paper in Nature, who asked the question of when a traveling wave goes across a region of the marmoset area MT, does it change the probability that the animal will recognize that input if it's near threshold? And the answer is that if the traveling wave reaches, it's actually a trough because the inside of the cell gets depolarized when the local field potential is a trough. You can see that the probability of a hit is much, much higher than when it misses. In other words, this is a huge, huge, huge p less than 0.01, and John tells me that this this is embarrassing for him. He spent a lot of his career studying attention and looking at how attention modulates the responses of cells. Well, it turns out this effect is about, John, what is it, like 6 times greater?
Yeah, that's about right.
Okay, there you go. So, so this really shows that it has a big impact on behavior. And so now we have to really take traveling waves seriously. As I said, everything that is called an oscillation really is a traveling wave, every frequency band. This is recent results from Mark Snitzer's lab. He has a voltage-sensitive dye that allows him to, with wide-angle lens, look down at the cortex of a mouse. And here are 3 different sequences, 2 different sequences. This is 3 milliseconds between frames. And you can see that this beautiful traveling wave in the gamma band, 30 to 80 hertz, goes across the cortex. And now 3 different locations along the cortex, you can see it's peaking at different times. It's about 0.1 meters per second, and that's the speed of unmyelinated horizontal, long-range horizontal fibers in the cortex. 0.1 meters per second. Now, it's not just local like V1. By the way, it stops when it gets to the border of V1. But we can see something similar in human cortex. These are epilepsy patients who have had implants of arrays of electrodes. And the idea is to search for the location of the seizure focus. Where does it start? Hopefully you can scoop that out and help the patient. In any case, they have these recordings going on 24/7 and waiting for the seizure. And I was collaborating with Sid Cash at MGH and had access to the data. And Lyle Muller and I analyzed it. So what you're going to see is a movie of what's called a sleep spindle. Sleep spindles happen thousands of times during the night in intermediate slow wave sleep. And they last for 1 or 2 seconds. They're 10 to 14 hertz. And it was thought, before we did this, that they were synchronous across the cortex. Okay, so let's see what they look like. By the way, the analysis that we did was, first of all, we know that they're 10 to 14 hertz, so we first of all filtered it in that bandpass. But we also used techniques from physicists who have to track fluid flows, right? And those algorithms are very good at pulling signals out of noise. And these are very noisy signals in general. Fluid dynamics. Okay, so here we go. Let's follow the white areas as it goes from the prefrontal to the temporal to the occipital, parietal. Okay, have I convinced you that there's a traveling wave? It's a circular traveling wave. It's a global traveling wave. And the speed is much faster, it turns out, about 1 meter per second. And that's probably because there's long-range association fibers that are connecting these areas across many centimeters. Now, there's concern here because these are epilepsy patients. Maybe what we're seeing is although we had like 6 subjects and they all show the same thing, maybe this is a damaged cortex. And so we collaborated with April Benasich, who does high-res EEG recordings from infants. And as you can see, this is a 6-month-old. These are the locations. And babies, by the way, love to sleep. They sleep half the time. And their skulls have very thin, very cartilaginous. And so recording from the surface is almost as good as recording from the cortex. Okay, so what does that pattern look like? It's going to be the same kind of a picture, but now it's going to be both hemispheres. And this reminds me of the images that we saw, of movies that we saw earlier from the rotating cylinders, right? Okay, so there you have it. It's really... So, you know, this is really important for the following reason. That it's known that these sleep signals are very important for memory consolidation. And the babies are just getting experiences galore, and they have a lot of, they're just putting down synapses, a tremendous exuberance of new synapses going in during the first year and a half. And so this is really an important part probably of organizing synaptic plasticity. Okay, now, what I'm going to tell you next is something that is conceptually very difficult, and I've had a lot of trouble trying to explain to people this new concept. It's a new form of population coding. Okay, and I call it space-time coding. Okay, so we know that you can get a wave, traveling wave, by giving a stimulus. There are two types of spontaneous waves, and then there's stimulus-induced waves. And so suppose that we put a stimulus in. This is visual space, and there's a little dot here indicating that we just activated those neurons. Well, what happens is that in V1, we're going to get activity that spreads over time, just as I showed you before in MT. But here it's going to be Q to the stimulus. And if we have 3 stimuli in a row, we're going to get 3 areas where we have initiated these traveling waves like pebbles in a pond. And eventually they're going to become overlapping and interfere with each other. In fact, this is an interference pattern that is similar to what you see in a hologram, except in a hologram it's spatial interference, and here it's interference across time and space. So here's the simple version of what I think is going on. We have a paper now in just came out just this month in Trends in Neuroscience. So you can look up Muller, Churchland, and Sainovsky. So suppose you have 2 locations in the cortex, A and B, and you have an input that comes in here at B at an earlier time. And B, by virtue of the fact that it has a connection with A after a time delay, will activate A. So A is getting 2 inputs. It's getting direct input, you know, from say the retina, and it's also getting information about a neighboring neuron with a time delay. Now, of course, the further away you go, the longer the time delay. So here's this neuron, here's the A neuron, and here now are the other neighboring neurons in, say, V1 across a column. And what's happening is that this neuron is getting information from many different locations at different delays. The further away, the bigger the delay. And it's mixing that information and making a decision about whether or not to spike. So the information here is carrying population information, because this is just one of many neurons, about a time interval. What's happened over the last time interval, as well as what's happening right now, which is the information coming in directly. And then, in turn, it projects out to all the other neurons. So we're mixing space and time. It's a representation that contains, it's very difficult to think about. How would you have a population of neurons? Well, it makes a prediction. And people have been doing reconstructions. They look at the activity pattern, and they see if you can reproduce the input. Well, we're saying if you give it a movie, you should be able to reproduce previous frames in the movie, as well as what's coming in right now, right? So that's something that could be easily done with data that people already have. But once you have this kind of a code, you can do amazing things with it. And in particular, we think that what's happening in the cortex is that as it goes up, the Cortex from V1 to V2 to V3, what's happening is that the window's getting longer and longer and longer. Now, not only do we think that this is now the traditional view of the cortex, but we know that inputs coming from the thalamus to layer 4, and from layer 4 up to the superficial layers, layer 2, 3, and then from there down to to layer 5. I gave away the punchline. These have similar kinds of functions and activity patterns. Dentate gyrus, like layer 4, is very sparse. It seems to be a preprocessor. Layer 2, 3 is a recurrent network like CA3, and CA1 is the output from the cortex, and it also gets a direct input from the thalamus. This has been known for a long time, I mean, but people have ignored this, right? So we predict that layer 5 cells are doing something very similar to a prediction error, and it's training up the layer 2, 3 cells to recognize and maybe compute with these recurrent inputs, with the sequential inputs that are coming in. Okay, so eventually you get from V1 all the way up to the prefrontal cortex. And this has been studied with fMRI and Uri at Princeton. Hassan. I keep confusing him with Uri Manor, who's now at UCSD. But Uri Hassan has shown that if you give clips, short clips activate V1 but not the prefrontal. But if you give it a long clip, prefrontal lights up. And that's because it's able to recognize actions, not just simple images. So here are the predictions. Waves in the cortex and hippocampus in cotemporal context. Connectivity matrix in the hippocampus is a line attractor. The primary function of place fields in CA1 is to represent prediction error in order to learn sequences of inputs. You know, if this is right, I'm going to win a Nobel Prize. I'm sure not all of it's right, but at least it's your predictions, okay? And also, this is something that's always confused me, is that my colleagues they put the rat in the new environment, and there's a place field there, all like it was sitting there, right? It learned, they call it one-shot learning. Why do they call it learning? You failed the prediction, to predict it. And now you have to learn, training up the recurrent network. And finally, and this is the connection back to the transformer, that it may be that the loop between the cortex and the basal ganglia are doing something very similar to what's happening in a transformer. So these are the wonderful people that I've worked with and collaborated with. Yossi, who did that work on the hippocampal model. Mia, the math major at UCSD. Max Welling, who I've worked with now, and he's a machine learning expert. Andy, who is now at Harvard, and Pat Churchland, who's helped me with many, many projects, including the computational brain. It was an oldie goodie, 1992. But now we've been working on this whole new way of thinking about a new conceptual framework for thinking about population coding. So thank you.
So maybe we'll take one or two really quick questions, and then Tanya's going to wrap up.
Hi, thanks for the delivery. And I have been, I couldn't help but notice that nowadays, people, more and more researchers have the tendency to connect, many, neurobiology and cognitive terminologies with the artificial intelligence, right? Like neural network, like just deep learning, the learning itself, like the cells, synapses. So, it's more and more like a trend. So, my question is, how do you like this, may I say, probably ideological trend in this research field? And do you believe that, this exuberant elaboration and exploration onto this correspondence will help us discover the true understanding of, for example, the biological intelligence and the strong artificial intelligence?
So, I think that this is something that came up in previous talks. What is it that you can learn from another field? Okay, you can get tools And that's one of the things that I showed you, the the hippocampus model, we're using tools from backprop to dig into recurrent networks and try to compare it to data, right? So, but there's another way that you can gain knowledge, and you can gain new ideas. So, you know, this transformer idea, you know, never occurred to me that you would want to get association. It wouldn't even occur to me where in the brain to look for it. And when the penny dropped when I was at the NeurIPS meeting, and Christopher Reed was giving a talk, and he said that we use this state space model. And I know a lot about state space model. He didn't know that there were traveling waves in it. I knew because I had already thought about the connectivity patterns, and you know, and so you know, Andy Keller actually went in to his transformer Mamba and saw the traveling waves. Apparently, the engineers thought it was a black box. So, you know, it's going back and forth. I mean, we're having this wonderful, exuberant, you know, revolution. I wouldn't even call it a revolution. I would say that it's kind of a transformation that has occurred just within the last 10 years with tools and techniques from the Brain Initiative that have allowed us to increase the number of neurons we can record from at the same time. You can't measure a traveling wave with one electrode. And connectivity patterns, behavior has been transformed. We can now do it with great accuracy in terms of the motor part of the behavior. So this is now, I think, a golden period. It's a golden period for neuroscientists with these new tools. And we saw some of the things you can do now to analyze them. All that data. I mean, in fact, it's almost embarrassing because, you know, this is called the Chinese curse. May you get what you wish for. And now we have you know, we're data rich, and we have all of these fantastic tools now, computational tools that we're getting from the people in AI and also from physicists. So, you know, I think we have enough data now that with sufficiently clear thinking, we can actually understand some of the basic principles of brain function, and I think even cognitive brain function. So I think we're living in this very special transition period where we went from having a very, by the way, I just want to say something to the work, all the beautiful work that's been done in the last century with single electrode. I think what they were doing back then is laying the groundwork for us by looking at what you can get from fast sensory motor processing. In other words, what happens in the first second or less is what they were recording from that single cell. But as Doris showed us, a lot of action is occurring way after that, right? In other words, there's a lot happening 100 milliseconds later, 200 milliseconds later, a second later, 2 seconds later. And that's cognition. Cognition is on a much slower time scale. And, but the fast stuff was great because you could do an experiment, you could interpret it, and so that's the foundation. Now we're looking at the second tier above that, the activity patterns that may involve higher order statistics, not just the mean, but maybe, you know, fluctuations, variance, and this is really it's a terra incognita in terms of conceptual advances. We need new ideas.
Thank you so much for your insights.
One more question from the back.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry, for the great talk. Regarding the traveling waves only, when you showed the infant baby's brain and the circling around of the waves, I would like to ask, would you, over there, did you focus or not? I mean, the authors, did they focus on delta and theta waves primarily, the lower wave bands that dominate an infant or children's brains mostly, or was it a generic wave band, and how have different wave bands been explored, because they go up to beta, gamma, and there is a large variation then if we come to that kind of analysis, because
okay, so first of all, the traveling waves have been discovered at all frequency bands, but they probably have different functions. I should also tell you, this is not published yet, but I was talking to Mark Snitzer, and he said that he's been doing recordings, as you saw, but in the hippocampus. And first of all, he says that it goes in both directions, the traveling wave, which is, of course, what you expect with the Mexican hat. But then he said perpendicular to that, you know, this is CA3, CA1 dentate, that dimension, beta waves, which is about 20 to 40 hertz. So, wow, I mean, now we really have to start thinking, because it's combinations of waves, grouping of waves. We know that in the theta waves, that they group gamma. So at the peak of each theta wave, there is a burst of gamma which lasts for a few hundred milliseconds. So that's interesting too. It means that they cooperate with each other, that they're organized, they're coherent. But let's just take one example, gamma. We know a little bit about gamma. We know that it appears in the cortex when you're paying attention to something. You get a burst, and it's like a couple hundred milliseconds. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons, right? So, first of all, you only remember what you attend, right? Things that happen that aren't relevant to what you're paying attention to, often they're just in the background, and they're not something that you're going to remember. Okay, so that means it may couple into long-term memory in some way. How could it couple into long-term memory? Well, spike time-dependent plasticity is an interesting form of plasticity in which you pair the pre and the post. Now, if you just do it once, nothing happens. In fact, if you pair it at 5 hertz, nothing happens. But as soon as you go above 10 hertz, then, and you do that, you repeat that, you can increase the strength of the synapse, or you can decrease it depending on which came first, the pre or the post. So potentiation and depression. And if you do it in gamma, you can really buzz, you get large changes. So this is something now that we're beginning to put the pieces together, right? We can think about how the waves are integrated, both in terms of transmitting information, population coding, and maybe even organizing how neurons are going to be told what's important for long-term memory.
Great.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's all thank Terry one more time.